Okay, so we're up to episode 4. We focused on, in the first 3 sessions, the roots of Renaissance culture in the humanism that looked back on the Roman period and wanted to resurrect the culture and values of the classical world, and how this led, given the rise in wealth of the Italian trading cities as the center of the commercial communication world between the East and North and Northwestern Europe, it led to a significant increase in the development of art from a patron and collector standpoint. How this vast pouring of wealth into the artistic manifestation produced the masterpieces that we've come to associate with the Enlightenment and, with the Renaissance. And now what I'd like to look at, and I call it Brave New World, because I want to look at the synergies that develop in that world between and among the invention of printing, the development of the voyages of exploration, which were necessitated by the rise of the Ottomans and their domination of what had been the Byzantine Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean, the rise of tremendous banking houses to fund that world of battling against the Ottomans and navigating the world for new routes to the East, and the impact of the Protestant Reformation. There's a synergistic conflation of forces and developments that comes to a head in the early 16th century. And that's really what I'd like to look at today. So I called it Brave New World: Printing, Exploration, Banking, and Reformation. And on the first slide, let's go back and look at the development of text reform, which was largely a humanist-inspired development. So what we'd had in the copying of text for 1,000 years were conventions. Conventions of abbreviations among the scribes. Don't write out an entire word or phrase if it's something that is easily communicated through some sort of agreed upon shorthand. And you see in the box on the right, these are just samples. So SPD, salutem plurimum dicit. You have this little abbreviation for Dixit or DA, and you looked at the text for context and decided which one it was meant to be. So they tried, it was so labor intensive that they tried to, using these kinds of codes, compress manuscript text into something that could fit for the expense, because vellum was incredibly expensive and paper wasn't used much in copying, and the time of the scribes was tremendously valuable, and usually taking place in the early Middle Ages in monasteries. But later on, as we will see, among the humanists themselves, as they try to copy some of the texts that they are now finding to revive them. So these abbreviations were to defray expense and labor, and they included suspensions and contractions and marks called sigla and superscripts, all sorts of tricks, as the box on the right suggests. There were variations in script spelling and abbreviation as different traditions of manuscript copying developed. Humanists look at this kind of potpourri, this sort of hot mess of various adopted manuscript standards, and try to introduce a common set of standards for their copies. and a common set of script conventions. So Petrarch, one of the first ones to really master reading ancient manuscripts that have been copied during the medieval period, argues against the so-called Gothic font, the black letter font. And on the lower left of this slide, you see how daunting a black letter is. I had some background in looking at Renaissance transcription. I never had any training in black letter. I look at it, it looks like it's impenetrable to me. So imagine the scholars who have to work on medieval manuscripts that were done in black letter, and not all versions of black letter agreed one with the other. So people like Coluccio Salutate and Poggio Bracciolini and Niccolò Niccoli developed a standard humanist script, as it was called. And there's an example on the right of so-called humanist minuscule, as opposed to what was earlier called Carolingian minuscule. And you'll see, even without any training, you can, if you stretch yourself a little bit, you can see the word morte beginning the first line. You can see spectaculo as the last word in that first line. You can see how much closer it is to what we think of as acceptable text for site discrimination. So it's characterized by space. They put space between letters. They reform spelling, and they reduce compression. Let's put the whole word in, so you don't have to be a kind of strange expert in understanding the code of the compression. So let's write it all out if we can. So humanist manuscript production, therefore, by the mid-15th century, by the 1450s, which happens to be, as we will see, just as printing presses are developed in Germany, the standards have come into existence. So early printing presses are going to use the standards developed by the humanists for hand manuscripts. And that's tautological, because manuscript by definition is by hand, writing by hand. So by the mid-15th century, so-called cartolaios, as they're called, they are entrepreneurs in the manuscript industry. So a very famous one, Vespasiano da Bisticci, had scribes make copies and sold them in an exchange market in northern Italy, and was the go-to person for anyone who is a book collector, anyone who's trying to flesh out their library. When we were looking at the Studiolo of Montefeltro, he would have gone to Vespasiano da Bisticci and said, I'd like to get copies of X, Y, and Z on order, and the cartolaio would either know where to obtain them or know who to go to have copies made from existing copies, and knew how to price them appropriately. And so a market was developed, and it was a luxury market. Make no mistake. Books were precious. You remember the books on the shelf of that sensational room that Mary is in as the angel Gabriel is going to invite her into her role as the mother of Jesus in the Crivelli painting that we saw way back in the first session. And the luxury items in the room to show off the success, the commercial success of the city of Ascoli, the small provincial city of Ascoli, and the room is chock full of high value items, and prominently displayed are books. And they would have been, given that the painting took place or was done in about 1480, 1485, some of which would have been manuscripts and some of which might have been early printed books, but with hand decoration, hand ornamentation. And that's what we're going to look at next. So when printing is developed in Germany by Gutenberg, it makes its way to really the center for luxury goods. Let's go to Venice. And this is where the major printers of the period, the ones that we now think of as the heroes of early printing, people like Nicholas Jensen, who's actually French, despite the last name, but who makes his way and establishes a presence in, among other places, in Venice. And the very famous Aldus Manutius, the most famous printer of the age, whose lifespan, as you can see at the bottom of this slide, is from 1449 to 1550. So really, his entire life goes from the invention of printing in 1455 or so to really the point at which the Lutherans decide to have their propaganda campaign in print format in the early 16th century. So humanist conventions and standardization of text dominate early printing. Early printed books, all books printed between 1450 and 1500 are called Incunabula. And they are luxury, collectible items. They're often, almost entirely, almost every one of them, decorated by hand. All the wonderful graphic frou-frou in the margins. This is not done with the standard movable type settings that you get in printing. So if you look at this Scipio, Cicero's Dream of Scipio, so it's the Somnium Scipionis ex Ciceronis Libro de Republica ex Sceptum, excerpted from the Republic of Cicero, and it's the Dream of Cicero. All the lettering would have been movable type, printed, and then everything in the surround would have been done by hand. So it's still something that is a collector's item and would have cost a lot of money to obtain. So the Incunabula have a lot in common with manuscripts, other than the fact that they're done on paper, not on vellum. And paper is an expensive commodity in the period, and it's the center in, I believe it, the city that is the Fabriano, that's the center of printing, is in the northern Marche, not far from Venice. And to this day, it's still a printing center. And the local university in Fabriano is where you go to learn modern printing technology. It's a university about printing, and where they have a little museum showing how paper was done in the late Middle Ages. But obtaining paper in this period was a great expense to printers, and we'll talk about that in a moment. One thing that the printing press introduces is the concept of the textus receptus, the received text. With printing, there's an attempt to be made, it's the humanist attempt again, to agree on exactly the correct text among all the variant versions that hand copying introduced, with all the errors that are insinuated into the text. So it's an effort to produce what we would now call a critical edition. That is a single corrected source version. And so what printing does is not only standardize the shape of the print, but it standardizes the content of the text. It's all going on simultaneously. And Nicholas Jensen in 1470 produces, and here it is below, the first Roman font. It's not Times Roman, but it is Roman. And there are his capital letters, there are his lowercase letters, there are his numerals, there are his subscripts, dollar signs, etc. And what we get is something that we've inherited right to this day in the art of typeface design. Aldus Manutius introduces two things: the octavo format, which I'm going to look at with you in the next slide, and italic, what we call italic, meaning the typeface that was developed in Italy, but specifically among the Florentine humanists. And it's the chief means by which classic literature was spread through Europe. So sometimes a publisher will say, well, we published, or a printer would say, we published that book in Fiorentina, meaning in Florentine. And sometimes, since it was in the so-called italic typeface, and sometimes they would say, we did it in Italian. This is the period in which Florentine becomes known as Italian. And part of the reason it is because of the italic typeface itself, the italics. The print formats in the early development of codex meaning book format printing. Here I will expand the view a little bit. You have on the top row, if something were done in folio, as they describe it, which is a large format, each printed page on side A would have a verso and a recto, and on side B would have a verso and a recto, and you could see how those would just get folded and then stacked together. The quarto, if we look at the second row, the quarto would, in one stamping on one side, have two versos and rectos that then have to get folded over, and then the seams split when you put it in. You remember early books in this period, you could get the book where the printed pages had been appropriately folded and bound together, and then you had to cut the pages, cut the fold so that you could flip from one page to the next page. And then there's that image of how they would get ultimately stacked together into the codex form. And indeed, you could even go smaller version to the octavo format, and there would be, in effect, 8 pages on each side of a stamped print page. And then side B would get stamped with 8 more. And then you do some fancy folding and you get a smaller edition. So if you took the print page, and you see in that lower center diagram, the folio would take up half the print page, the quarto would be in quarters, and the octavo would be 8 to a page. And then here is our friend Billy Shakespeare being stamped and folded appropriately into, I believe this would be into a quarto edition. Yeah. So page 1, page 2 would be printed on the back, page 3, page 4, page 5 and 6, page 7 and 8. And then the whole thing would get folded and cut appropriately after it had gotten sewn into a binding. So all these techniques, as you can imagine, are going to make books more quickly achievable, And so the number of books and the access to books is going to increase apace. Now, the Incunabula, which are still collector's items, and in the lower right of this slide, here's a book of hours, both in Latin and French, illuminated for the Condottiero Ferrante d'Este. And clearly, this is a collector's item, this book of hours, but there's big money in it. And so between 1452 and 1500, all these little dots on the map are where printing centers develop in that half century. And the size of the dot indicates how many editions could get produced in that area, and the color of the dot designates which period. So we see, for instance, that Venice, Paris, Cologne, Nuremberg, Strasbourg, and Rome between 1461 and 1470 become large 1,000 Incunabula editions published in those places, all within 1 decade. So we can see that how this really catches on, and there's a luxury market of the first order. So early book printing targeted collectors by emulating manuscripts. So we saw that there are, and we talked about collectors in the last session, men of the church, men of the condottieri class, wealthy families, hiring artists, trying to collect objects of every kind. They are the target audience for the Incunabula. Printed editions often went off to artists who would add these illuminations. By the 1470s, printed books appeared in the collections of all these buyers, who we find in letters often complain that the booksellers were passing off mass-produced copies as the real item. They were still thinking it's the psychology of the horseless carriage. People are still thinking back in terms of the previous technology. Oh, those letters were not made by somebody's hand, by the manu of the scriptus. Those were just stamped on a piece of paper. That's cheating. And of course, the result is exactly the same thing. And the printers said, well, we can get many more copies out, and you can complain, but we're going to make more money this way. So we're going to keep on doing it this way. The publishing market, and here's an example of the way something would get done in the publishing market. The printing press made a lot of these humanist rare texts, put them out there, made them accessible because they're now standard editions of it. So when it became known that a printer, and we'll use Nicholas Jensen, whose lifespan was 1420 to 1480, he's older than Minucius, he could supply a translation of, for instance, and this is one of the books that he started advertising, Pliny's, the Roman writer of the first century, natural history in quantity. And as soon as this announcement was made, well, the market came to his door. So partnerships formed then among bankers, merchant bankers, humanists, and printers to exploit business opportunities. So in 1475, the Florentine banker Strozzi hires the classicist Landino, the humanist, who we saw in that painting of him in Montefeltro. There's one of the patron with the humanist Landino, to translate the Pliny text, because we want it in Italian. Now, we find there's an audience. And then engaged the publisher Jensen to run a print run of 1,000 copies on paper and 25 copies on much more expensive vellum. So you needed somebody to finance it. You need the house printer you needed a consortium of people. These were all people who, in one, if you will, commercial pod now. The target audience for this run, and the reason they requested it, that is that they knew there was a substantial Italian expat community or communities, because remember, the Venetians and the Genoese are the major traders in the north of Europe as well, in London and other commercial centers, Paris and in the Low Countries and the like. So we know we have a lot of people who can read Italian, who have money, who are living abroad, and they want to get their hands on a copy of the Pliny. They're educated in the new humanism themselves. The Agostini merchant family of Fabriano is engaged to provide the paper. So now we have a larger consortium of interests, all meeting to produce the 1,000 copies on paper and the 25 copies on vellum. So in these early days, printed books, they're not really consumer goods yet, like spices or textiles. Strussi and Jensen left space on the printed page for post-printing and hand illumination, so that people could then do something further with their text if required. Despite its significance in the spread of the world of the intellect, the emerging printing industry was destined to be controlled by commercial interests. It was the banker Struzzi who set the sales price of the Pliny translation for the paper editions at 7 ducats, which is affordable, not cheap, but affordable, way more affordable than it would have been in manuscript form. And can you imagine trying to get 1,000 copies of anything in manuscript? So book printing had expanded beyond the market for rich patrons. It was now possible to own a portable collection of great beauty. You didn't have to be Montefeltro. You could be a commercial business guy in London working for one of the Italian banks, and you could build up your own substantial, affordable rack of printed texts that now did not cost an arm and 3 legs. It wasn't like collecting Crivelli paintings. It was something closer to affordable, despite the fact that it was still not nearly commodity printing yet. So, but the price was right. On the upper block, this is a passage of Pliny's Natural History. And the reason I put this up there is because he made a point that he was printing it in Fiorentina, in Italian. Nascano per se medesime, etc. And this would be what it wound up looking like when it was sort of done up to the nines. So, in the 16th century, it's going to take off. In the 16th century, in fact, before we even look at the reasons why, if we look at, jump the slide, if we look at the European output of printed books by century, and in the 15th century, it's absolutely minuscule, but look at the 16th century, where the numbers just leap off. There's by a factor of, the 16th century probably represents a multiplier of 10 to 20 or 30 over the number of printed books in the 15th century. And it'll continue through the 17th, through the 18th, etc. Printing expanded to meet the demand for significant ancient texts throughout the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Okay. But that would have been how many people literate or who wish to be literate in ancient literature were there in the target audience. That would have grown incrementally. You would have sold more and more, but it would not have been a geometric leap that's represented by the difference in those bars between the 15th and the 16th century. Increasingly, affordable volumes were printed without illumination, without decoration, without precious bindings, still to the educated, but the numbers would have been limited because only a small percentage of Western Europe was educated and would have aspired to own something, no matter how cheap it was, something that was printed. Enter, at this point, Martin Luther and the rise of the Protestant Reformation, with its focus on, as Luther himself phrased it, faith alone, grace alone, scripture alone. Sola fide, sola gratia, sola scriptura. Lutheran Protestantism criticizes church hierarchy, says it gets in the way between the personal contact between the Christian, individual Christian, and his or her God through the direct action of grace and through the direct contact of Scripture. So you have this empowered priesthood of the individual who is now hereby sent out to face Scripture without the filter of a priestly papal hierarchy standing between that individual and the text. Take the text directly. The grace of God will lead you to the understanding of how it should be read. And this was the engine behind an explosion of literacy in the 16th century in the Protestant countries, the Northern European countries largely. Because everyone's told, two things. You should read Scripture directly and not have it interpreted by a third party. And to help you along, we're going to do two things. We're going to translate it into the vernacular. In 1522, Luther publishes a German New Testament. And in 1534, he publishes the entire Bible in German. He was a tremendous scholar of Hebrew, Greek, Latin, etc., all the languages he would have needed. So we're going to translate it, number one, and we're going to put it out there in cheap printed editions that were devoid of the silly ornamentation of book collectors of Incunabula. We're going to change the market around. So the real engine that dramatically stimulated the growth of printing was the Protestant Reformation, with that double focus on Scripture and the priesthood of the individual Christian. The theological warfare between Protestants and Catholics, the Reform movement and the Catholic Church, instigated a media revolution because the Catholics had to catch up almost immediately. By 1530, over 10,000 titles were published, a total of 10 million copies. By 1530. One of the dominant forms of printing in this period were what I call here vernacular manuals, how-to books, both catechisms, like the Luther Catechism that I show on the right, which was published in 1536, at least in the edition that's showing here. And you see it's totally readable, and Caridian, which means a manual or handbook. Der kleine Catechismus, okay? readable from Dr. Martin Luther, 1536. Even we had no trouble with the script at this point. Manuals, though, stretch to everything. Once you develop this literate audience, there will be manuals, how-to books on everything under the sun. Mechanical, how to build a windmill, it's the YouTube of the age. The Protestant use of the vernacular to educate the now empowered laity produced the very effective small catechism. It's a guide for parents to teach their children about religion and theology. And the Catholic Church, of course, in the Council of Trent, develops the idea of its catechism. And any of us in this group who were raised in Catholic schools had to memorize the Baltimore Catechism, as the American church published its own version of it. And you got, what is a sacrament, etc. When do you have to go to mass, etc. And you had all these standard block answers to the central questions that the child should be able to answer. And then you were quizzed on this during your confirmation. The local bishop would come around and to see if Susan asked what a catechism. A catechism is the teaching of Christian theology. It's catechize. It's from a Greek word for teaching revealed truth. So catechisms, the large catechism published by Luther, as opposed to the small one, was addressed to pastors to aid them in teaching their congregations, and to fathers for instructing their families. So everybody in his place, there is a target audience for all these enchiridions, these manuals for teaching. And the Council of Trent, as I said, also produced a catechism, the Catholic Council of Trent. But it was aimed at the education of the clergy and was published only in Latin. The Catholic catechisms did not get published in the vernacular until a later point in time. Now, printing, of course, lends itself to the propaganda war between Protestants and Catholics. So what we see on this page are woodcuts taken from pamphlets, and I've used German woodcuts from the Protestant world to propagandize their position and to demonize what they perceived as the decadence of the Roman Catholic Church. So the theological battle spilled into political conflict with the Protestant side, couching their appeals in increasingly vituperative broadside pamphlets. These were cheap one-page and two-page pamphlets that could be printed in the tens of thousands and sent all over Germany. Caricatures proliferated of corrupt churchmen selling indulgences to fund papal projects. Well-known artists who sympathized with the reform cause, such as Lucas Cranach, created the iconography for the new pamphleteers. So here is the Pope as the Antichrist, ego sum papa, it says at the top. And every little German child in the north of Germany, every Hamburger would have been scandalized by this picture of the church. And here, Cranach published a series of contrasts, cartoons, if you will. This is just one example of just dozens of these. On one side, you have a picture of what is depicted in the Gospels, and on the other side, you have a caricature of what the Antichrist does in response to this. The Antichrist being the Pope. So the Christ here is driving the money changers out of the temple. This is a place of worship and a place of sacrifice. How dare you sully it with interest and profit? What's the Pope doing? He's selling indulgences in the temple and collecting gold. He is the money changer. So it's Christ und Antichristus, as it says in the German here. Anyhow, so all the political cartoons of the next 5 centuries, in effect, take guidance from the Protestant Catholic wars of this period. So printing in this period then becomes a commodity. It becomes a commodity industry. By the time we get to 1550, a century or so after printing was invented, movable type was invented, we've now developed what we now can think of as a modern commodity industry. There's no longer any necessity to emulate the embellished manuscript. In 1505, before the Reformation, we have a price list from the shop of Aldus Manutius in Venice. A 2-volume Homer in Greek cost about 1.5 ducats at a time when a master mason or a teacher made 50 to 100 ducats a year. So the Homer, so if we have the 2-volume Homer, the Iliad, represented about a week's wages. By the mid-16th century, print runs of 4,000 to 5,000 dropped prices considerably. Single sheet broadsides and manuscripts were quite modestly priced. The highest expense for the printer was paper. And so some printers even found backers to buy paper mills. It was a kind of vertical production system. The printer wanted to have the person who knew the languages to translate. So he had his writers on staff. He wanted his paper to come from in-house. He had his actual printers on staff, and he was probably closely allied with an investment bank who was invested in his business. So everything would take place in-house. So on the left, Luther's very famous 95 Theses, which were handwritten and nailed to the door of the Cathedral of Wittenberg, here, a couple years later, are printed and spread in pamphlet form. Here are my objections to the sale of indulgences. The Disputatio pro declaratione virtutis indulgentiarum. In this chart, you have the gray line is the growth in the number of editions between the years 1495 and 1635. The red line is total volumes growth, and you see how they reflect each other fairly closely. They track each other, the number of editions and the number of total books. But the dotted line, price, and look at the period between 1505 and 1535. So look at the curve of price between, let's say, right around here, where this thing falls off the cliff, between 1505 and 1535, the price per copy, per volume, just collapses. And the profits of the publishers are never higher, even though the price per copy has never been lower. So we have entered the modern world. So there is a tremendous market shift. Artists who had produced work for patrons or for the high-end collectors market saw the advantages of a mass audience. And some of them, like Albrecht Durer, whose dates he's born during the Incunabula period. We know several of his famous lithographs and paintings, which are, tremendous works of art. He dies right at the heavy going of the Protestant Reformation, and he is, as we'll see below, is a huge fan of Luther, and he wants his ideas to reach a greater and wider audience, and he almost entirely gives up painting, despite the fact that he's a profound master, to develop woodcuts. Here are the four horsemen of the apocalypse to accompany an edition of the Apocalypse of St. John, that at the end of the New Testament, the last book of the New Testament. So the four horsemen, the famine, and etc., are there. So recognizing the capacity of printmaking to reach a wider, less affluent readership, Durer plunged into the new form and made it something of an independent art. It becomes an art form in its own right. The following diary entry is from a shopping foray that Durer makes when he's off on some sort of business trip. And you can see what the relative prices of books are by his little diary entry. I have bought a tract of Luther's for 5 Weisspfennigs, however, 5 white pennies, whatever amount that might mean in modern currency, I don't know, but see what it compares to. And I spent another Weisspfennig for the condemnation of Luther, that pious man, and gave 6 Weisspfennigs for a pair of shoes. So I get a tract of Luther's for less money than a pair of shoes. And I got his condemnation of the church, whichever document he's referring to there, on a broadside probably, for the price, 1 Weisspfennig for beer and bread. So for the price of a meal, I was able to buy that other little broadside of Luther's. So between 1517 and 1526, some 2,000 printed editions of Luther's sermons and books were published, many of which Durer bought. And a letter to his protector, who's the Elector of Saxony, Durer writes, "If God helps me to come to Dr. Martin Luther, then I will draw his portrait with care and engrave it in copper for a lasting remembrance of this Christian man." Not paint an oil portrait. I will engrave it in copper so they can stamp out his picture and send it out to the masses for lasting remembrance of this Christian man. And I beg your worthiness to send me for my money anything new that Dr. Martin may write in German. I don't read Latin. Anything he publishes in German, please, sir, send me anything that you can get your hands on that he is now publishing. Now, we'll take a little movement off in another direction, but you'll see how it comes to bear on the synergies I want to point to in this period. This is also the period printing gets invented, 1453, 1455. Constantinople falls and becomes Istanbul in 1453. The Ottomans consolidate this map on the bottom. You see how it's just different periods of their consolidation. All of this is Ottoman controlled, either directly or indirectly, between 1481. And there's a section that gets added in the 17th century, but we're not even looking at that. 98% of this is developed by the time we get to Suleiman and the period between 1520 and 1566. And it threatens, look at the map closely, Vienna and the Holy Roman Empire of the Emperor Charles V, Don Carlo here. So here we have a portrait of Suleiman, who, by the way, had to import Italian painters to do a portrait, which was sort of an offense in the Islamic tradition. So they weren't great portrait painters in the East. So the fact that we have portraits of Suleiman show how interested he was in Western developments. And here's a Titian of Charles V. But in 1526, an army of 100,000. This is the period, medieval armies. I mean, if you look at Agincourt or, wars between France and England and the early 15th century, you're going to find armies of 4,000 knights and with the retainers, maybe there's 10,000, counting the suppliers of the knights and bowmen and that kind of thing. Now we're going to enter the age of cannons and armies armed with arquebuses, early rifles, if you will, and armies of 100,000 and more. So here's an army of 100,000 under Suleiman the Magnificent, who defeats the Hungarians and poses an imminent threat, one, to Vienna and the Holy Roman Empire, which he really wanted to have, and two, the Venetian and Genoese control of trade in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Ottomans absorbed the trading sites that were controlled along the Dalmatian coast of what we would think of as Croatia and Serbia, and all through the Eastern Mediterranean, and along the Black Sea, which had been a Genoese center of influence. So in effect, they take over the trade centers of the Italians and they threaten Vienna. European resistance is going to be led by Charles V. And by the way, although I don't have a sample of it here, but there'll be a reference to it in a later session. When he was holding Vienna siege, which he did twice, Suleiman had contracted with Venetian artisans to produce a war helmet that was also something of a crown and something of a like a tiara, like a papal crown, encrusted with jewels of the first order. I mean, the most magnificent piece of jewelry production ever done in Venice, apparently. And he contracts, and they need like dozens of workers to complete this thing, to put on his head as he parades outside the walls of Vienna to create the impression that you think your emperor is someone of power and magnificence. Well, get a load of me, as he promenades outside the walls of Vienna in his new toy. The wars between the Ottomans and the Habsburgs, engaging these gigantic armies, were seen at the time in the 16th century as a war for civilization. The confrontation of Europe and the Turks was on a scale not seen since Roman armies were fighting along the Danube. Ottomans laid siege to Vienna twice, to Malta, to Rhodes. The Venetian holdings in the Levant and the Black Sea were completely overwhelmed. The famous sea battle of Lepanto in 1571, which was a victory for the Western Christian states, and is memorialized by every major painter of the late 16th century. I just show you two of them here. There are dozens of battles of Lepanto in 16th century painting. Here is a Tintoretto. And you see what the impression they're trying to convey, that this battle, it's endless. The scale of it takes up the entire sea. Hundreds of vessels, thousands of men. And here is an allegory done by Paolo Veronese. And so it's I'm assuming, what do we have here? Is this Christ or Mary? It's hard to make out in this, but certainly responding to the defenders of Christianity and shining grace over the forces of Christianity that are going to fight the Turk in the East. So a Tintoretto and a Paolo Veronese. My point in taking this segue to mention this contest between Christians and Turks is that warfare required such a spectacular concentration of capital that it was the impetus for the rise of the great merchant banks. Now the banks were not just funding Venetian trading vessels going off to the Levant to bring back spices. Now they had to fund. They had to lend money in the hundreds of thousands of ducats and florins, depending which currency they were using at the time. And so people like Jakob Fugger, the founder of the great German Fugger Bank, and here is his picture his portrait being done by Albrecht Durer. The wealth originated in the Italian textile trade, but under Jakob, they expanded into silver and copper mining, the spice trade, and banking. Copper was strategic because it was used in gun manufacture, and because of that, was the central exchange medium in the spice trade, because Ottomans wanted to get their hands on copper to build their own cannon. And so before these wars, copper would be exchanged for spice in the Eastern Mediterranean by the Italian trading cities. Now they needed to produce it for their own self-defense. His family was the main source of the huge loans needed by the Habsburgs to fund their wars. In return, what did he get but exclusive mining leases that formed the basis of a family fortune estimated by one historian at $400 billion in today's currency. So he would have been anywhere from 3 to 4 times wealthier than the wealthiest person in the world now, based on his backing of the Habsburgs. An English ambassador wrote in a letter to I guess the court, tonight after some time, spoke with the agent of the Fuggers, who told me that by letters from Deutschland, they hear the Turk had defeated the Hungarians and that the Hungarian king, is dead. He was sure that if the king had 150,000 ducats more, he would have destroyed his enemies. He would have been able to defend himself. So now modern warfare is going to be about the economics of warfare. Portuguese exploration in this period gets its impetus from the same development. So all those early exploring expeditions, people like Vasco da Gama rounding the Cape of Good Hope, etc., all those attempts to get to the Indian Ocean were done by an Atlantic-based power, because the Mediterranean was not useful in this regard. An Atlantic-based power that wants to capture the markets in the Indies that had been controlled by the Italians and were now a bridge too far. So these voyages are going to get funded by the same imperial and banking interests that are there to oppose Ottoman expansion to begin with. So here we have a report by one Girolamo Priuli in 1501. 3 of the ships, Portuguese ships he's talking about, came from Calcutta. The news was considered very bad this is as early as 1501, very bad for the city of Venice. And truly the Venetian merchants are in disarray, believing that the Portuguese voyages will ruin them. Jakob Fugger took notice and with his monopoly in copper, made huge investments in the backing of Portuguese expeditions. So now the development of navigation and the voyages of exploration, which were commercial in spirit, were going to be backed by the same backing interests that were backing the wars against the Ottomans. Simultaneously, then, with all of this borrowing reaching levels never before anticipated in the early Renaissance or late medieval worlds, what had to be addressed were the strictures in the theological strictures from the Middle Ages against usury, the lending of money for profit. which is why in the late Middle Ages, only Jews really were bankers on a small scale, and some of the trading cities. So through the Middle Ages, money lending with interest was considered a violation of Christian principle. By the 16th century, the demands of an expanding commercial world, as well as the development of modern nation states with these immense fiscal needs, tested that. You needed a reform of the conception of banking for it to take place without a black cloud over it. So the Protestant rethinking of society, in light of their rejection of centralized papal power, increasingly saw the secular state as an arena with its own rules. So once you break papal power, now the question is, are the cities that no longer adhere to papal Catholic rule, are they to be ruled by the local churches? And in some cases, the radical Protestants set up their own little theocratic centers. Remember the Puritans who came to North America wanted to set up their own little theocratic colony. And Luther and the larger churches of the Protestant stamp reject this. The arguments, they argue for a formal separation of church and state because they don't want to see the West fragmented by little startup churches, each controlling their own little political entity. Luther's major theological ally, Philip Melanchthon, argued that the law of Christ was not to be taken as the basis of the civil social order. Let the civil world direct itself and legislate itself. In 1545, Henry VIII in England introduces a new, very pragmatic definition of usury, that lending with interest up to 10% was considered legal. And the Catholic theologian Johann Eck defended the charging of interest by defining loans as risk-taking investments, which in church tradition justified a fee. So in effect, what you get in the 16th century is that commercial enterprise is ideologically separated from the moral framework of religion. You could do business without it being totally controlled by religious or Sharia law, if you will. So here we have a moneylender and his wife and a Belgian painting of the period by Quentin Matsys. Now, the voyages of exploration, which I have already pointed out, are completely organized for commercial motives and funded either by royalty with loans from banking interests or by the banks themselves. And the banking interests were often given trade and things like trade and mining privileges. These voyages, which will ultimately set up the colonial empires of Western Europe, have a tremendous impact on what had been the political map of Europe just a half century or a century earlier. And just before we get to that, I want to point out that to execute these voyages, you needed tremendous cartography, and this cost money. The Portuguese, by the way, kept their mapping information secret. Their guys would return with maps. I should go back to the previous slide, I should say. So everything garnered by people like da Gama and Cabral on their voyages was not Magellan, sailing for the Spanish, had to discover stuff on his own because they couldn't get their hands on the Portuguese maps. Cartography was considered proprietary. In 1492, a German merchant consortium at Nuremberg commissions a man, Martin Beheim, to create a terrestrial globe that map the commercial opportunities of the known world. So if you look at his globe, he's got all kinds of information here. Hey, here's where you can get tin. Hey, here's where you can get coffee. Here's where you can get pepper. The maps were very annotated with available commodities in each locale. And as you see, I turned the globe around. This is a back picture of the globe. There's no continent between Europe and the Indies. Why did in 1492 Columbus go sailing directly west to hit the Indies and was surprised and shocked to find North America and South America in between? Because they didn't know any better and assumed, whoops, where did I go? And assumed that they could get directly to the Indies by sailing west. Now that we've talked about printing and the rise of the Ottomans and the rise of banking and the rise of navigation for commercial purposes and the rise and the Reformation's role in some of this, I want to talk or address the idea of synergies, how all of these working together produced and extended the impact of the Renaissance in ways that are not usually associated with the Renaissance. So I call it here worlds collide: humanism, collecting, banking, printing, Protestantism, and science. So Ottoman expansion threatens the Holy Roman Empire and devastates Italian colonies and trade. So, one, vast bank loans are needed to fund the emperor. Two, vast financial backing, banks, are needed to fund commercial voyages of exploration. Humanism and collecting create a market for the printing of ancient literature. One, cheap mass printing developed for the spread of Reformation ideas. Two, commodity printing develops a market for the new science and technologies used in navigation. So what people are going to need to do the navigation, maps and new instruments, new navigational technology, require both financing to develop and printing to promulgate. And so printing, which has its roots in the humanist enterprise, winds up being the mechanism for conveying and spreading the new sciences, thanks to banking loans, thanks to Protestant motives along the way. This new commodity enterprise of printing will become the source of the sciences that are going to revolutionize the world in the late 16th and really in the 17th century with the likes of the Galileos of the world and ultimately the Isaac Newtons of the world. There's been this tremendous commercial shift. When I said that the power bases in Europe have been transformed, power in a half century, power has moved from the Mediterranean, you look a little more closely at this map, from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic coast. All these voyages of exploration are beginning along the Atlantic seaboard. And here, these colored blotches on the different continents are the colonial empires that are going to be set up by the Spanish, by the French, by the English, by the Dutch, by the Portuguese. So power is going to move. This is the Renaissance begins in Italy, and the forces it unleashes destroys the central power of the Italian city-states, and in a matter of century and a half. So the power has shifted from Italy to Portugal, to Spain, to Holland, to England, and to France. Italy is going to descend into its 400 or 500 year role as the museum that wealthy Europeans go to for their classical education on their grand tours. European commercial zones become overseas colonies, as this map suggests. Banking and investment power move north, Germany, England, Belgium, France, and Holland, to where the European trade products are actually manufactured. Remember, Italy was central between taking the trade products produced in France, Belgium, Germany, etc., England, textiles, all kinds of stuff, copper, and then sailing it over to the east, where it could get exchanged with spices that were coming up via the Red Sea after along the spice route out of Asia, etc. No longer. Now these goods don't have to go to Italy at all. Put them on boats directly. And those boats will go wherever they have to go. They'll go to Brazil. They'll go to the Americas. They'll come around Africa. They'll go to India to trade. They'll go to Borneo. They'll go to Java. So the shift, this is the period in which Southern Europe becomes the poorer place rather than the richer place. Now, I want to focus on a painting that will bring together several of these themes and synergies that I've been arguing for. So collecting, the new learning, and printing. In a focused portrait, this is two men, Renaissance men, if you will. This is a Holbein. It's done in 1533 at the Tudor court. These are the French ambassadors to the court, and surrounded by a variety of things, including this, and we'll talk about this and look at it more closely, this angled skull, anamorphic skull, as it's called, in the bottom of the painting. This painting has several incredible layers of symbolism that we could talk about for an entire session, but I want to just go over the more obvious elements in it. And so you can see that they're also surrounded by all these artifacts of the new learning. Collecting by the privileged class included the new scientific instruments. This was the age of the Renaissance man and woman whose accomplishments were displayed as ornaments of their proudly public personalities. The objects that reflected scientific and technological advances took their place alongside portrait medallions, musical instruments, and fine print editions. The Holbein portrait of the ambassadors to the Tudor court, Jean de Danteville and Georges de Selle, juxtaposes the usual trappings of wealth and rank. We have our obligatory Turkish carpet, our ermine and sable trim on the garments, our damask hangings. There's all the useful, the kind of musical instruments that we saw in the cabinetry, the marquetry of the Montefeltro studiolo. So all of this, the trim robes, but they're also including an elaborate array of scientific instruments that reflect the new rage for navigation, cartography, and astronomy. We're just a generation before Sir Francis Drake, spreading his cloak over the puddle for Elizabeth I. So navigators are entering the scene as part of, if you will, the missionaries of the new science. And we see two globes. We'll look at these more closely in the following slides. And let's look at some of them. So in the portrait, all these scientific instruments. So we have a terrestrial globe, a land globe, but also a celestial globe, which was used by sailors to chart the constellations and try to orient themselves to sail according to the stars with the kind of instrumentation that you needed to pinpoint locations. Sundials of various kinds, a polyhedral sundial, a shepherd's dial, which is another kind of sundial, a quadrant used for calculating sun's angles and distances, a universal equinoxial dial, a torquetum, Appian's arithmetic book, which was important for doing calculations on star distances and the like, all in one painting. So these are men of the New World. They are the new Renaissance men, not just surrounded by classical documents and documents from the poets, but documents of the new sciences, because we're entering the period when Europe will begin to see the new sciences as rivals of anything that the Romans and Greeks ever achieved. And so the Ptolemaic organization of the solar system is going to get challenged as a result of mappings done with instruments of this kind going from this point in time through the 16th century. There's also in this painting a reference to the stress of the Reformation. It's 1533. Henry VIII is trying to get an annulment of his marriage from the Catholic Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess, so he could remarry to try to get a male heir. His ultimate threat was to move toward the anti-papal positions of the continental Protestants. So he's beginning to entertain arguments that the Pope is not the final answer in all things. And Holbein suggests this. It's interesting that he has a compass here, a calculating instrument. But this psalm book is a Lutheran psalm book. They've actually identified which psalm this is by looking closely at the lettering. And the lyre has, if we look closely, has broken strings, suggesting that there's tension and discord and that not all is right with the world. And remember, these representatives are from the French world, which would have been a Catholic world. So there's a lot of layering going on in this painting. And then finally, the images of death. So there's a crucifix up in the upper left of the painting, which I haven't showed you in detail here. But there are symbols of the active life, and they're contrasted with the crucifix that's up in the upper left and the anamorphic skull. This was an age of smallpox. This is an age of intense religion. Death was quite a central motif. And as a note, there's a Holbein portrait of Thomas Cromwell from the same year, in which he has a plague mask on his desk, much like the little masks that we use for COVID. The skull is a dominant detail. Why the skull? Does it commemorate the motto, the family motto of the Donville family, Memento Mori? A remembrance of death. Was Holbein just showing off his virtuosity? It is interesting that even though the angles of foreshortening are the same, the lyre looks realistic while the skull looks distorted. This is the head-on view of the skull. This is the view of the skull as you walk to the right of the painting. And the National Gallery has given us this wonderful little video of changing our angle in the painting, and voila, and there is death. So images of life and discovery, images of death. Holbein was doing it all. Now, worlds collide. humanism, collecting, banking, printing, Protestantism, and science. So here's an example. A famous intellectual and scientist, Regiomontanus, whose real name is Johannes Müller von Königsberg, who's a 15th century figure. He's a mathematician, an astrologer, and an astronomer. He produced a German epitome of Ptolemy's Almagest, and this brought him to the attention of the Greek humanist Bessarion, who we stumbled across already, who had the largest library of mathematical and astronomical manuscripts in Europe, who took him into his household. Now, he's aware of the shortcomings of the Earth-centered theory of the solar system, the geocentric theory. He developed and published astronomical tables and a mathematical text called On Triangles that included important theorems in spherical trigonometry, essential for calculating distances while allowing for the curvature of the Earth, and therefore something that would be indispensable to navigators and astronomers. He founded the world's first scientific printing press in the city of Nuremberg, which in the 16th century became the leading center for scientific publishing. Nicholas Copernicus, the great astronomer who suggests a sun-centered solar system. In 1538, a young German mathematician and protege of Philip Melanchthon, the theologian of Luther, a man named Rheticus, visited the Polish thinker, went and saw Copernicus in 1538, some 50 years after Regiomontanus dies, and brought him German books of interest to astronomers, including On Triangles, the Regiomontanus book. Melanchthon was a leading German Lutheran theologian and educator who promoted the new sciences in German universities. Copernicus modified his handwritten text, his famous On the Revolutions of Celestial Spheres, by inserting 2 pages with the calculations of Regiomontanus as the mathematical justification of circular planetary orbits around the sun. And Rheticus took the manuscript back to Nuremberg to be published. So here we have the perfect example of worlds colliding. So scientific ideas originating as among people who have access to the ancient literatures like Ptolemy, then can do their own theoretical mathematical advancements. This because of the expansion of the publishing industry. In affordable book format, this can be taken to Copernicus in Poland with some of the latest mathematical texts that might help him think through his theories, because he's beginning to develop a name for himself. He inserts those developments into his text, into his manuscript text, and gives it back to the kid to bring back to Nuremberg to get printed and promulgated. And these are the books that are going to influence the Keplers and the Galileos of later in the century, at the end of the century, in turn. So all these humanist elements utilizing Protestant developed commodity printing, and interest in the new sciences and collecting, all bring together these mutually influencing strands to literally on the same table. Science goes mainstream. We have a portrait of Nicholas Kratzer, another Holbein. Again, here are the instruments. And in 1534, Johann Schöner, another German based in Nuremberg, for sailors, published or created his famous celestial globe. And there we have it. I am going to stop the share, and I will try to, where am I? I'm trying to unpin myself here. Give me one sec. And there you all are. I've only left this about 5 minutes. Sorry about that. But any comments, any remarks?
Lou?
Yeah, Lori.
What kind of patronage would have been behind those new paintings, the ones that didn't contain, any reference to, or contain minimal reference to religion? Still the same wealthy families acting as patrons for
Sure.
the artists?
Yeah, so for instance, if you will, the consumers of those Holbein portraits would have been the people sitting for them, who would have been people of sufficient wealth, to provide the artists with a reward for their own work. Holbein is someone who never got involved in doing commodity promotion of stuff. He did high end, and that painting is such an extraordinary masterpiece. I mean, again, we could have spent an hour and a half unpacking elements in that painting, but I think in the High Renaissance, almost never was the collector's interest unless it was a priory or a church of some kind, essentially for a religious motive. I think almost always it would have been, this is a wonderful thing to have in its own right.
Great, thanks.
Anyhow, I hope I didn't obscure too much with my effort to create the sense of how all these strands of development that begin in one place start weaving in and around one another and are going to result in a modern Europe that is very recognizable to us, where all these layers seem to be embedded one in the other.
Lou, this is Joanne Polner and Alex. I am overwhelmed and full of gratitude to you for telling us so much in such a great way, everything.
Okay.
My whole education is explosion and expanded. And I'm like close to tears. It was so beautiful. It was just so fantastic.
Okay.
I have children and grandchildren that I'm going to recommend that this is the way to learn. This is great.
They're all online. Even grandchildren can.
Yeah. Several in college and one out and two coming.
You have to be over 70 like the rest of us here.
Yeah, well, I'm in my 80s, but I just love listening to you and how you put it together. I'm so happy to be educated this way. Thank you so much, really. It's a gift.
Thank you.
Yes, both of us. Thank you.
Any other questions? Or if not, we will resume next week with the next two sessions. We'll have some interesting elements in them, but I'll wait till we get there. Anyhow, have a good week.